Okay, this lesson is for grade 11 bio. This is an HL only lesson. So if you're an SL student, you do not have to do this lesson. You just focus on getting your redo this week. We'll be doing an activity as a whole class later on, but the main two lessons this week are going to be SL release. So we're talking about growth in plants, part 1 for for HLs. These are the only two things we're talking about today is undifferentiated cells in the meristems of plants allow indeterminate growth, and that mitosis and cell division in the shoot apex provide cells needed for extension of the stem and development of leaves. We're talking about different plant cell tissue types and really setting ourselves up to do the more complicated cell plant growth next class. Okay, so in plants there are 3 main tissue types, and each of these tissue types has its own structure and its own function. You need to understand these, you'll understand how plants grow in general. So we have dermal tissue. If you look at this diagram here, the dermal tissue is the blue, it's the outside layer of the plant, the leaves, stems, roots, everything has dermal tissue on the outside. These little cross sections, a leaf cross section, a stem cross section. Okay, so dermal tissue is the light blue bit. So it protects the plant from physical agents, so from wind, from pathogens, from animals, water loss. The stomata are found in the dermal tissue, all those things. The ground tissue is kind of the general tissue that's most things besides dermal and vascular. So it includes all the storage cells that have very thin walls. It includes like mesophyll cells for photosynthesis, includes sport cells, it includes secretion cells. Everything that's not vascular or dermal is ground tissue. And then vascular tissue, of course, is the xylem and phloem, and we use that for transport of water and minerals in the xylem, and water, sugar, hormones, RNA, all those things in the phloem. Okay, all 3 of these types of tissue come from meristematic tissue, and meristematic tissue is the tissue that is first, where a plant is first growing. So up here, the very top where it's growing tall, that's a meristem up there. And you would also have them in the bottom here and some lateral meristems as well. The plant is growing, it's going to have meristematic tissue. So meristematic tissue can be found throughout the plant. You should think about 3 different places where a plant grows. So a plant grows in the roots, in the shoot, in the leaves, in the width of it. If it's a woody plant, all these plants grow in different directions in different ways. And what happens is a meristematic cell will divide, and one of those 2 daughter cells will stay a meristematic cell, and that's called an initial. And the cell that differentiates is going to be what's called a derivative. So we have derivatives and we have initials that comes from these meristematic cells. It's kind of like stem cells of plants. Most plants exhibit what's called indeterminate growth. What does indeterminate growth mean? It means there's no real ending to the growth. The growth is continuous based on available resources. They'll continue to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. There's not a set size. Like in humans, we grow to a certain size and then we tend to stop. You hit 17, 18, maybe a little bit older, depending if you're a male or female, and you stop growing regardless of how much food you have. You just stop growing. Whereas in plants, that tends not to be the case. But some organs, such as leaves, they exhibit determinate growth. They only grow to a certain size and they would stop. So why would they stop growing? Well, one reason is we need to have the leaf big enough that can still be supported by the plant. And if leaves grow too big, they're going to be shading other leaves, and that means like other leaves can't photosynthesize. There's a balance between having leaves that are big enough to get lots of sunlight, lots of photosynthesis, and having them too big that they can't shade other leaves that are too heavy and bulky. Okay, so let's talk about the life cycles of plants. So if plants exhibit indeterminate growth, they're always growing, then when do plants die? If it's going to always grow, that makes sense that they would never actually die. Well, we know that's not true, and different types of plants have different kinds of life cycles, and those life cycles include death. Okay, so look at this diagram. I want you to take a minute and differentiate between an annual, a perennial, and a biennial. What's the difference in the life cycle of those 3 things? Okay, so hopefully you thought about this for a second here, and you figured out that in an annual, they only grow one flowering period, so usually 1 year. The seed will germinate, it'll grow, it'll flower, produce seeds, and die. It's 1 year's growth. So if you're a gardener, annuals aren't the best because you only get 1 year out of them. Whereas in a perennial, you can get multiple flowering cycles. It could be two, it could be many more. The plant germinates, grows, and flowers, and it kind of goes dormant for the winter. Then it goes back to growing, flowering. So this kind of plant is really good for gardens. You don't have to replant them every single year. And biennials are kind of in between. They do it only twice. So they would germinate, grow, become dormant, grow, and then they flower, and then they die. So these particular plants don't flower in their first season. They only flower in their second season. This will come up to be important a little bit later in the lesson. Let's talk about meristems. So we know that meristems are the parts of tissues that grow in plants. So we have different types. We have terminal meristems, we have apical meristems, lateral meristems, root apical meristems. So apical meristems, sometimes called primary meristems, those occur at the tips of roots and stems, so up here and down here. And that's the plant is going to grow longer. And that type of growth growing longer is called primary growth. And that leads to non-woody tissue, so stems and roots that are quite kind of flimsy still or not woody in the tree. They're the younger branches and roots, and that's the apical growth. The shoot apex, the top of the kind of the shoot of the plant here, that includes apical meristems, but also the surrounding tissues are also developing as well. So it's not only developing here, also developing side to side as well, not just vertically. So what are the advantages of apical growth? If I'm growing taller and deeper roots, what's the advantage of that? Well, if I'm growing taller, hopefully I have more access to sunlight. Maybe I can get out of the shade of competitors, avoid them shading me completely. If I have longer roots, I can reach further in the ground, reach more minerals, reach more water, the water table. Maybe I'm more stable in the ground as well. Those are all advantages to apical growth. So increase access to water minerals to the roots, increase support from the roots, and increase access to sunlight and carbon dioxide being higher off the ground, less competition from other plant species. Okay, lateral meristems, also known as secondary meristems, they happen throughout the plant, not just at the top and bottom, but all through the entire plant, and they allow for secondary growth, which is where we have increased thickness. So woody plants are very good at this, and they have very substantial lateral meristems. They give you very thick, wide trunks of trees. Think of that as an example of secondary growth, and they have very complete meristems here. So there's two types of tissues, meristem types. You have the vascular cambium, and the vascular cambium, you can see it here in the diagram over here, it's vascular cambium. Okay, it's found inside the stem, and it's going to produce new xylem cells. Okay, and we know xylem is actually a really important part of wood. So these are all bits of xylem, and new phloem cells towards the outside. So xylem towards the inside, phloem towards the outside. It's going to make both of those things. Very important. Make sure it makes sense. Vascular cambium makes vascular tissue. The core cambium is found just inside the bark over here. Okay, and it's going to produce the cork cells, which is the outer bark. So the bark here of the plant has phloem, and then just outside here, underneath the main outer bark, is the cork cambium. Okay, the cork. Okay, so if you look at this diagram, and this is a skill you need to work on, is making sure you can identify the different meristems. And again, if you were in class, we look at this under the microscope. I'm going to try and find some images for you to look at just to practice looking at them. So here's my plant, and I kind of zoom in. Here's a shoot apex. This is the apex bud, the top of the plant that's growing taller. If you look at some plants in your house in the garden, you'll notice this. And under a microscope, this is what a cross-section looks like. You can see the baby leaves starting up here. You can see here all the cells differentiating. Look in the stem. Inside the stem, you have the cork cambium, which is on the outside, and the vascular cambium on the inside of that, in a woody plant. And then in a root, you can see the shape here. You have the root cap down the bottom where there's no cells really dividing. You have root hairs, and you have the root meristems up above that. The very tip is not dividing, that's the root cap protecting the newly dividing cells. Okay, so we have apical, and we have lateral. Primary growth, secondary growth. Okay, so key idea, the meristems of a plant allow it to grow in several different ways using cell differentiation as the mechanism by which meristematic cells become specific types of plant cells. So from meristem to being ground tissue, or dermal tissue, or vascular tissue, depending on what the plant needs. Okay, that was it for today's lesson. It's a short one. One of you has time to prepare for your redos this week. A lot of you are doing redos this week. We will come back to finishing off growth of plants later on in the week. Make sure you send in your redo corrections at least one day before your signed up redo so I can make sure I upload the corrections.